All right, let's get started. Today I'm excited to present to you Ashley Dalrymple. She's a biomedical engineer who finished her PhD in neuroscience at UFA in 2019, and she's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pittsburgh. And today she's going to tell us about a cool real-world application of RL.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to present this work to this group because it wrapped up before I ever had a chance to come back to a tea time talk. So actually having these virtual actually allows me to share this with you guys. And it's also my first time presenting it to a comp sci audience rather than neuroscientists and engineers. So I'm also a little excited to maybe go into more details of the technical aspect of machine learning. But first, I'll just give a brief overview of spinal cord injury. So spinal cord injury is where there's damage to the spinal cord and you end up with motor, sensory, or autonomic deficits, so paralysis. And then the severity of those deficits depends on the location and the amount of damage to the spinal cord. So for example, if you have a spinal cord injury in your chest area, then you have deficits in everywhere below this. So for example, a spinal cord injury in your thoracic spinal cord would mean paralysis in your leg muscles, as well as bowel, bladder, and sexual dysfunction. Now, restoring walking is a really high priority for people with paralysis. But something that's really interesting about the spinal cord is even though it's injured here, everything below it is actually intact. So for example, there's an area called the lumbar spinal cord, and it houses all of the cells that go to the leg muscles. And it's actually, pretty normal functioning after spinal cord injury. So you can actually then target the spinal cord to restore functions such as walking. So this is where we get into a technique that our lab used called intraspinal microstimulation. So what we do is we target that area, the lumbar enlargement, which again houses the motor area in the spinal cord. And if you put very small wires into the spinal cord, into this motor area, and you deliver very small amounts of current, you can actually get movements in both individual muscles as well as multi-joint synergies. So if you have an array of wires and you implant them throughout the entire enlargement and provide stimulation in a set pattern, you can actually restore functions such as walking. And so the lab I did my PhD in has been doing this technique for many, many years. And they've been working a lot on control strategies and also kind of testing the limits of this. So because it's fairly selective with these wires getting implanted in the spinal cord, you need a method to control the stimulation to get a certain pattern of walking. A benefit of going into the spinal cord instead of going to the muscles directly is that this technique is actually a lot more fatigue resistant. So you can actually get longer distances of walking. And so previous work in the lab showed that you could get nearly 1 kilometer of walking. This is overground and propulsive walking in cats using this method of targeting the spinal cord to activate the muscles in the legs. And they did that with just a simple state machine. However, what is a lot more common in spinal cord injury is having an incomplete injury. So that means that you have variable paralysis in both of the legs. And even the extent of that paralysis can change over time. So a simple state machine doesn't really seem to cut it when you're trying to restore walking with such variability and so many differences between different people. So, you need a new controller that is able to augment remaining function, is able to adapt to the day-to-day changes, as well as have easy initial tuning and setup, especially for clinical translation. But ultimately what this is coming up with a personalized controller to restore walking in people with an incomplete or partial injury. So this is where we decided to start on the route of using machine learning for these controllers. So I'll first show you as well kind of how we test our controllers in an experimental setup with this intraspinal microstimulation. So we test it in cats. So we have a cat that's anesthetized, so it's asleep, and it has an intact spinal cord, so there's no spinal cord injury. And what we do is we suspend it in a sling that's on a cart over a walkway. And the walkway has force plates underneath it, so we can get both left and right ground reaction forces. And then we also put gyroscopes on the limbs so that we can get the angular velocity of each limb. And now to mimic an injury, so to mimic, we started with just a hemisection spinal cord injury model, which really just means hemiparalysis or one-sided paralysis. So what we did to mimic it in an anesthetized cat was we actually had a person take one of the limbs and move it in cyclical motions, mimicking what would be voluntary control of the cat moving the leg through the different phases of the walking cycle. And so here I just have a little breakdown. We just approximate the walking cycle into 4 phases. So the person's moving that limb, and then we can use information from the force plates and the gyroscope and use that to feed back into the spinal cord implant and provide stimulation to move the other leg in the opposite phase of the walking cycle. So this is how we get a walking model to test our intraspinal microstimulation controller. Now, initially what we did was very simple. So we just put thresholds on those sensor values, so on the forces and the angular velocity, and use that to make those transitions through the walking cycle. So again, a very simple state machine. And I'll just show you how that performed, because I think this is really important in justifying why we then moved to machine learning. So we had 4 different people take turns to move the limb through the walking cycle. We didn't really give them much information. We just said, walk the cat's limb through a walking cycle. And so each color here is a different person. And you can see that they differ quite a bit from each other. So for example, for the person who's outlined in black, if we were to put a threshold here for their forces to indicate, now it's time to transition from one phase to the next, then that threshold is not transferable to, say, especially the person outlined in red. So that means that we would have to customize the thresholds, and we did have to customize thresholds for each person. You will also notice, especially the person in green, they vary quite a bit over time. So defining a threshold for this person is really difficult because they're so variable. And even though this is an approximation to an injury model, in spinal cord injury, you are going to have that kind of variability, especially with partial paralysis. So putting thresholds on these just raw sensor values isn't going to work very well. And so what we did instead is we actually went to reinforcement learning, and instead of using raw sensor values, we looked at instead learning predictions of those sensor signals and seeing if they would be more reliable. So the algorithm of choice, we used true online TD learning to learn general value functions of the ground reaction force, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, as well as an unloading signal. So we defined that as a weight-bearing threshold minus the ground reaction force. And what this is kind of an indication of falling that's specific to the weight of each animal. And so we learned the general value functions of these signals for just the limb that's moved by the person, because again, that's our control limb. That's the one that's intact, and we want to use that limb to control the would-be paralyzed limb. So I just put in the parameters here for your information. So our step size, eligibility trace, bootstrapping parameter, and the termination signals for those 3 different sensor signals. And then we just we started things up during walking. So we had our eligibility traces and the weights and the general value functions initialized at 0. And then we started making those walking movements. I will also point out that we did not use tile coding. So courtesy of Travnik and Pilarski, we decided to implement selective Canova coding for state representation. So I chose this largely because I was actually working in MATLAB and not Python. So I had to recode everything, and it was really easy and really simple to implement selective Canova coding, but I also thought it was just elegant and simple in the way it's implemented. So what we did is we actually chose 6 different sensor signals to represent our state. So it was 6-dimensional, and that was made up of the left and the right ground reaction forces, the left and the right angular velocity from the gyroscope, the sum of the 2 forces, as well as the exponential average of the force produced by the limb that's moved by the person. And so we randomly distributed 5,000 prototypes in the 6-dimensional space and kept that constant throughout all experiments. And we would then define our current state as according to the C closest states. And we actually used 3 different levels of those C closest states. So it's kind of like overlapping tilings, but in a way customized more for selective Canova coding. So that's how we did our state representation for the true online TD. So that was how we learned the general value functions, but how to actually turn that into a control signal to use during our experiments. We actually borrowed the concepts from classical conditioning and control. So just to remind everyone, when you have an unconditioned stimulus, such as food, and you present that to a dog, its response is going to be to salivate. Now, if you precede an unconditioned stimulus or the presentation of food with a conditioned stimulus, or say ringing of a bell, then over time, this stimulus will now start to elicit that fixed response. And so in our setup, the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the raw sensor values or the cumulants. And then the conditioned stimulus is actually the general value functions that we're learning. And then the response is going to be the stimulation output into the spinal cord. And so here I just have a little snippet of the signals of interest during walking of the limb that's moved by the person. So in black here, you can see this is the cumulant, and then the blue is the general value function. So you can see here it is rising and falling nicely before the cumulant is. And here I'm just showing how we actually turned this into Pavlovian control. So instead of putting thresholds on the cumulant or the raw sensor value, we instead put thresholds on the general value function. And these are what's now driving those transitions through the different states of the walking cycle. So those are just indicated by the vertical lines here, but these horizontal ones indicate where those thresholds were placed for these experiments. And those thresholds were held constant throughout all of our experiments. All right, so this is what it actually looks like in a cat. I'm sorry if it's choppy streaming over the internet, and hopefully it plays again. But you can see there's a person moving the limb in the background. And so again, we're learning these signals that are being produced by that limb. So we're learning about the forces and the angular velocity. And using those predictions, we are controlling stimulation in the spinal cord that moves the limb that's facing you with the markers on it. So just to remind you again, this cat's anesthetized. So the pushing of the cart across the walkway is actually only being done by the limb controlled by stimulation. So that's also why it kind of has like a little bit of a limping motion, because it really is like just pushing off from one leg only. And so we did this for multiple trips across the walkway, and each trip we considered to be a trial. So we did a few different types of trials. So we did trials where we reinitialized everything to 0, so kind of like learning from scratch, and we just see how fast and how well learning started initially. And then we also did trials where we continued with the same general value functions and eligibility trace and weight vector that we had at the end of a trial, carried it over to the beginning of a new trial, and looked at how well it would continue. So I will say that, apart from the walking looking pretty nice, the performance worked really well. So here I just have the learning curves. So for the 3 signals that we're predicting, the general value functions, using the real and estimated return, and calculated the mean squared error. And you can see within just about 2 seconds, the error is extremely low. So it's learning quickly, and it's quite accurate very early on. And even for the angular velocity, the scale here is much smaller than for the other signals. So again, like very, very quickly. And here I'll just show you exactly what that looks like. So again, the black is the cumulant here, and then the online versus the ideal return are in the purples. You can see that they overlap quite well. And again, like this is a trial where everything starts from 0. So you can see, within this first step here, it's already producing very accurate predictions of the signals, which doesn't seem too far-fetched because they are very periodic and smooth. But importantly, this accuracy continues as we go across different people and different cat experiments. So I'm just showing you again how fast learning is. So here again, these trials where everything's initialized at 0, just showing a very specific example of, where we haven't learned much yet. So the general value function does not increase before the cumulant. So what we have here is instead a threshold on the cumulant that triggers the next phase of the walking cycle. So this would be like the unconditioned stimulus kicking in because the conditioned stimulus didn't in time. But you can see now by the second step, we have the general value function rising before the cumulant. And so that threshold crossing now initiates the next phase of the walking cycle. And you can see by the solid lines that follow that trend continues. And then if we look at trials that continue over more than one trial, you can see now that the general value function is a lot smoother. So it does become a lot more accurate over time. And also the proportion of transitions between the different phases of the walking cycle are more likely to become predictions because they're so much more accurate. And so we actually quantified this. So you can see here in these early learning trials, about 87% of the different transitions for the steps are triggered by the general value function crossing the threshold rather than relying on the cumulant itself. And then if you go beyond one trial, the proportion is much, much greater. So it's getting close to 100%. And I will also point out again that this is actually lumping together all the different trials with different people walking that limb, over 5 different cat experiments. So we're throwing in a lot of perturbations and we have a lot of variability in the walking that it's getting, and it's performing really well. And even if you look at the proportion of steps that required a backup reaction, like most of them, it's always, within the first step. So again, showing you that it happened, the learning was accurate enough, quickly enough that it was able to produce prediction-driven transitions through the walking cycle. I'm not sure how much time. I have lots of time left. Okay, I have some backup slides that we can cover if we want, because there's lots of cool things I couldn't really show you. But just in summary, general value functions were learned very quickly during these walking trials, and it allowed us to produce overground walking. The thresholds that we placed on the general value functions were compatible across different people. So as I showed you earlier, there was a lot of variability in the walking styles that people produced, as well as the timing on how they move the leg. And that's analogous to, people day to day and how they do their normal walking. No two people walk the same. But also if you consider the spinal cord injury population, there's a lot of variability in the extent of their paralysis and how different people change. So the fact that we didn't need to tune those thresholds across different people, I think, is really promising, because that means that if you were to translate this into the clinic, the clinicians don't have to spend a lot of time getting everything set up, which saves time. You also, it wouldn't require a lot of retuning, which I think a lot of these devices need. So by that, I mean, over time, as you walk, as I said before, you have day-to-day changes. Especially because this could be considered rehabilitative and their function might actually improve over time. So the fact that this would automatically adapt to that also means that they don't have to keep revisiting their clinicians to get their device retuned. This was the first application of Pavlovian control for a neural interface, and it was implied in vivo in cat experiments. So I thought that was really exciting for the comp sci world, kind of seeing this kind of work applied in kind of a more real world situation, even though it's cat. And from what I said before, with allowing it to have personalized walking. So I think that's probably like the most important thing that we allowed here. And I'm really excited to see how this work progresses. I think there's a student taking over this work, but eventually I'm going to revisit it because I have lots of ideas of how you can expand this to beyond spinal cord injury into other areas of paralysis. So for example, stroke and traumatic brain injury, they're more likely to have that one-sided paralysis. And so this kind of control strategy could be used really easily in those kind of populations. But I also don't think it's limited to stimulation in the spinal cord. So I think this kind of stuff could be implemented and even maybe tested more easily in things like exoskeletons and prostheses. Yeah, so I think it has a lot of potential and a lot of area to grow. And lastly, but not least, I would just like to thank my co-authors. So this is a student that did, like, those experiments take a long time and they run overnight. They're like 24 hours. So he's my partner in crime through that. Rich, was there to, help guide me through a lot of the conceptualization of these control strategies and kind of get things going. And then there's my supervisor, Vivian Mashawar. If you want to read more about the paper, it's down there. But I also would like to give a little special shout out to Patrick, because in that photo, just like in real life, he was like my little cheerleader, cheering me on throughout my whole PhD and through this project, and even let me crash his lab meetings, where the whole Polarski lab often helped me and would answer lots of machine learning questions, because my own lab didn't have any expertise in machine learning. So being able to just talk to people about what I'm doing and why does my data look like this, between him and Rich, they were super helpful in getting this project going. And we have lots of time for questions now.
Saying this was cool would be an understatement. I'm sure everyone will agree. So yeah, I mean, it blows my mind in more ways than one, in the sense that, okay, not only could you train the GPUs accurately, but the hardware involved, in the sense of using these predictions to do something to the spinal cord in order to get the movement in the other leg accurately. I don't know how much noise gets added in that process, and the fact that you could make it work, that was amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe we can start with a question about the threshold. So you said that you were able to set it the same across people, cats. So how was the threshold set in the first place? And can you tell us, like, the primary reason you think it doesn't have to vary among people?
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
How is the threshold set, and any ideas about why it doesn't vary among different cats and people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so the first experiment that we had, the thresholds that I had put on there from just my bench testing, which was like me pretending to be a cat. We had a couple of experiments to get some of that preliminary data and try certain thresholds, and then we adapted the thresholds once, but then never did it again. So I think the reason why they are robust to the different people and the different cat experiments, kind of once we got it right, was, the predictions are not, the general value functions, they're not as susceptible to, the small amounts of variability that you would have with different people. So in the transition from one person to another, initially there's quite a bit of variability, but then then they're usually a little bit less variable themselves, or, so that transition might require like a backup backup reaction. But often, again, within that first step, it adapts quickly enough, that it's able to then use predictions to drive the phase transitions thereafter. But also, like, we're updating things at 40 milliseconds. So, the updates are happening a lot quicker than, a full step cycle. So we're updating multiple times within a step cycle. So that also helps with having everything learned pretty quickly. If I can I'll show you like one thing beyond that I think is really cool, that kind of, we tested adding perturbations to the system. So like intentional mistakes. And this was modeled especially after spinal cord injury. Their walking isn't that stable. They might trip, things like that. So we actually would ask the person who's walking the limb to just somewhere in the trial make a mistake. And we also didn't define what that meant. So it could be lifting the limb up, pressing down, shaking it, slipping it. And then we looked at how quickly everything adapted, in the step following. So here's an example where the leg remains lifted. And so you can see, based on the new information, the general value function is increasing. But then, once the step gets back into its regular pattern, it gets right back into the pattern that it learned. So in the step that follows a mistake, almost all the time, it was followed by a prediction, because these predictions are sound enough that they're able to return. And I think that's largely due to because these signals are quite periodic, and I think they're fairly easy to learn as well. So that's a really big benefit. But also putting thresholds on the prediction is also just like, it's a very good, fast way to get things moving.
Cool. So did you have some kind of constraints for the prediction to be like between 0 and 1, or like so that it's kind of the predictions are uniform across people? Otherwise, maybe if I lift the leg a little low as compared to somebody who lifts it a bit higher, then I would assume the threshold would have to change. But since it isn't, so maybe everything is constrained to be between some.
Yeah, kind of. So based on previous work that we had done, I had a usable range of where the sensor values would lie. So say for the forces, like basically we would never exceed a certain value. And then that was normalized to 0 and 1 for putting together the state space. But there was no other kind of normalization or anything that was done between people. We would literally, go on the computer and hit go, and then we would change places and then hit go. So there was no adjusting anything in between different people.
Cool, thanks a lot. There's a question in the chat, if you have a look.
Yeah, so how do we deal with sensor noise? How do we make sure the data recorded from different sensors are synchronized? Okay, so dealing with sensor noise. So the sensor signals are filtered with a hardware filter before they are digitized. The sensors themselves aren't that noisy. They're not, like I avoided accelerometers because they're quite noisy, but the sensors that we used were chosen for their simplicity and their reliability. How to make sure they're synchronized. So basically we just had a DAC that came in, streamed into MATLAB, and we would just, capture all of the sensors all at once. And so we didn't do anything other than like, here's a snippet of like a window of the sensor information, take the average, and then that's between all the different sensors at that time point, every 40 milliseconds, that would represent the current state. And then we would use that into the function approximation. What did you use for GVF cumulants? Do you mean like the algorithm? We used true online temporal difference learning.
Sorry, no. What was the signal being predicted?
Oh, I see. So we had 3 signals. I'll just scroll up here. They were the ground reaction force, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, as well as a signal that we refer to as unloading, which is weight bearing minus the ground reaction force. So this one's more dependent on the actual weight of the animal and indicates it like a falling signal.
Okay, so with these you were able to use these 3 signals, so that gives you 3 GVFs. Yes. Mm-hmm. How did you map that up to the 4 states, or to the 4 responses?
Yeah, so you can see here, so I just have them indicated in these, I guess, horizontal lines where the thresholds were placed. So for example, the force here was used, so that one general value function was responsible for 2 different phases of the walking cycle.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I had a second question,
Sure.
Which is, what would happen if the animal was awake and started adapting to its leg moving without its full control? Like,
that's a loaded question. So I think the cat would override the stimulation. I think that their volitional control would override, or it would interfere with whatever they're trying to do. So I think to test something like this, you would need to have a cat that has an actual spinal cord injury if you actually wanted to test the interaction of the cat with the machine learning. Because you would need the cat to produce voluntary movements on one side, and you would have to have paralysis in the other, so that you can actually have like a more realistic model of this. But for testing the controller initially, we didn't want to go through the whole spinal cord injury process and all of that. So Yeah, there's a lot to play because there's the implant and there's the machine learning, and then you would have the cat, and they all have to work together. I see another question in the chat. So we have measurements from 6 sensors, motion induced by a person.
We're trying to understand what the data is and what the prediction problem is and how the data is defined. And
yeah, so I guess we're learning predictions about these 3 signals from the limb that's moved by the person, but the state representation, so the state space is using sensors from both legs. So we're using both the left and the right legs. So in a way, the state space and part of the learning is actually using the responses produced by stimulation in its state space. Does that answer your question? And then these thresholds
yeah. So just to break it down, so you want to predict for like the phases of the motion, whether there are these 4 phases of the motion. Then you somehow generate the data, and then you mark up the data. So someone's going through the data by hand and then defines which phase the motion is in, or how do you get the ground truths, or whatever purposes, I guess, you need the ground truths.
Yeah, so those phases are indicated. You can actually determine these 4 phases from just the forces and the angular velocity. So I have a previous paper where we do that in like a more state machine way. That's just kind of how the walking cycle is defined. So for example, when you have late swing to touchdown, that's when your limb is, going to heel strike. Mid stance is when you're fully loaded on one limb and the other leg's in the air. Propulsion is where you're pushing off, and then early swing is starts when the leg goes in the air. So you can imagine, early swing starting when the leg goes in the air. That's when the force goes to 0. So that can be easily defined by the force signal. The angular velocity can be used to indicate the transition between early swing and late swing because there's a tilt change when the limb's in the air. And then touchdown happens when the force starts increasing again, because that's when the limb starts touching the ground. And then this one, mid stance, is when the force is at the peak. So you can actually set these definitions. And so using that knowledge, that's how we constructed placing those thresholds on those sensor signals.
Okay. And then you are trying to predict, based on the time series data, the sensory measurements, the actual phase.
Chava,
No? Okay.
I can clarify. Perhaps I can clarify.
Yeah.
This is not just a prediction problem. It's
Okay.
It's Pavlovian control.
Okay.
So the
Another
idea
question
it is intervening and changing the behavior. When the predictions exceed the thresholds, then control signals are generated. And so it's actually not just a prediction problem.
Okay. So the controls. Okay.
So we're predicting these signals.
That in the experiments, the control signals are going to be input to what, the cat, or like
Yes, they go into the microstimulus wires that go into the spinal cord.
They directly went, like in this experiment, into the okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was not super clear to me.
Oh, okay, sorry.
The definition.
It's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. These cats actually have had the wires installed in them, and then they've got all this control system that's set up and digital analog converters, and it's injecting the current into the tiny little wires in the cat's spinal cord.
And so what's the effect of that stimulation if the person is also holding the limb of the cat? Is the other limb that's being moved by the cat, or?
So, because the cat's asleep, so it's not capable of making any movements itself. So that's why a person is there to move one limb to mimic the movements that the cat would normally make if it were able to move one of their limbs. So you can see this video showing the person moving one of those limbs.
Right.
And so we're
measuring movement.
Yeah, we're measuring forces, we're measuring the angular velocity, and then we're making predictions about the limb moved by the person. And then we put thresholds on those predictions, and that's how we get the Pavlovian control of the stimulation of the spinal cord.
What is being controlled here? The other leg?
Yeah, so the leg that's facing you with the markers, that's moving in the spinal cord in response to the predictions learned from the other leg.
I had this suspicion, but it was not completely clear to me that this is what's happening. And so what's the definition of Pavlovian control?
So for the Pavlovian control, we have
I don't understand how it works, but like, what do we call Pavlovian control?
Using predictions to initiate a fixed response, right? And so we have predictions, which are the predictions of those sensor signals. And the fixed response is the stimulation output. So we have 4 phases. And so let me just escape here. So we have those 4 phases. And so the Pavlovian control is using this prediction with this threshold. That's producing a fixed response, which is a transition to a new phase of the walking cycle.
And what would not be Pavlovian control then?
Well, our alternative here is to just use the cumulant or the raw sensor value and use that to transition it. So without the predictions, that would be like the unconditioned stimulus or like the traditional sensor signal that would cause the transition from one phase to the other.
That would correspond to, I guess, gamma equals 0 or something like that. So it's a limiting case of what you have here, no?
No, this just using the sensor values, that would just be a simple state machine. And, that's been used a lot in the field.
No, so what I'm wondering, the cumulants are defined in terms of discounting. And the discount factor, the presence of the discount factor makes these signals, makes them predictions of what happens in the future, right? But if you set gamma to be 0, then you're basically predicting what's happening now. So in the limiting case, when gamma goes to 0, we get back what you say is not Pavlovian control. So it's like you can interpolate between like, I'm predicting so far ahead or not.
I see, yeah.
And in general, you would want to call something Pavlovian control when gamma is positive or something like that, or?
Yeah, so like gamma was tuned. So each of these general value functions had a separate gamma. So that was found empirically for, what gave the best results. Some of these signals, like, for example, the unloading, the ground reaction forces, they're a lot more consistent and stable than, say, the angular velocity. So I think that one, I forget what the actual numbers are there on a previous slide, but I think these ones had to be predicted even further in advance. So I mean, like, there's those kind of design considerations that had to be made when we were setting it up.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Very cool. Thank you.
I noted Patrick said, is there a possibility the animal can eventually biologically learn from this method? I think, again, a loaded question and would have to be tried and tested in an awake animal. I think I would hope so, at least a human. Patrick?
Yeah, sorry, that was the question after my question. My question was actually maybe a very straightforward one. That if I'm remembering right from the other animal literature, I'm thinking like Gregoire Courtine and folks, that in fact the motion of the other limb, so the limb controlled by the person, has more. It's not just that you're sending that into the state machine. It's that the module of the spinal cord, the neuronal connections in the spinal cord, are using the information from the feedback from that limb to interpret the stimulation and provide the correct response in the other limb. Is that right? Like, is in fact there that level of interpretation provided by the motion of the limb in addition to what you're doing in the control system?
So yeah, not in these experiments because the cat's anesthetized. So all of those like reflex pathways and interconnections, they're going to be shut down by the anesthesia.
So the anesthesia is applied. Sorry, Ashley. The anesthesia is applied actually at that level of the spinal cord. I mean, I'm not really thinking about the upstream. You actually anesthetized that entire like collection of spinal cord tissue as well.
Well, yeah, because it's systemically anesthetized, so it's
Okay,
just through an
crazy.
IV. So yeah, it affects everywhere.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Cool. Thanks. That helped a lot.
And that's how we also know that the movements that we're getting are 100% produced by the stimulation in the spinal cord, and not by through some reflex activity of us moving one limb and having it affect the other. So we know that that's not possible because it's anesthetized. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. That was an awesome answer.
Thanks, Patrick. Why is there a 4-phase abstraction of walking used as opposed to modeling? Cool, good question. 4-phase initially for simplicity, because 4 phases are a lot easier to deal with than trying to separate out a lot more minute phases. Initially, we had actually considered modeling, especially if we wanted to get into a true incomplete injury where we have deficits in both legs that are incomplete and partial. And then being able to provide stimulation is needed to both legs. However, if you can find someone to build us a cat model where we can tune the muscles to have different amounts of paralysis, and then we can hook it up to this controller, I would love it, and I would collaborate with them because that's exactly what we want to do. But it just became too big of a scope for my PhD. And also we just didn't have anyone in the lab with the expertise to build a computational model. But that's definitely the direction that we headed, and got terminated just because of those scope issues. But I would love that.
Thanks. That was an awesome talk. I'm trying to understand one point though. Is the idea to learn how to imitate the walking pattern done by the person who's holding the limb? Is that the goal?
Yes. It's using one leg to control another leg, right? So the premise is you have a good leg and a bad leg, and we're using information from the good leg to control the bad leg. So yeah, kind of, that I think, yeah.
So is it kind of related to behavior cloning, where you're trying to imitate that other behavior, the policy of the person? Is it related to that?
I would say not completely, because we're not trying to imitate behavior. We're not dictating how much force the leg should be producing, or where in space the leg should be moving. It's very much just a prediction crosses a threshold, and then the stimulation defines what the phase of the step cycle looks like. So for example, we would have different electrodes for different functions. So to get swing phase, you need hip flexion, and you need your ankle to your toes to point upwards to clear the ground. And so the implant kind of dictates the movements that are produced by that limb, not so much the algorithm. And it's not really mimicry. Yeah, so it's kind of a complex answer because it's biology too. In just, the movements that are produced during each of those phases.
So does that mean the stimulation causes quite a complex compound movement?
Yeah, it does. And it actually, it's nonlinear. With each cat, the implants were slightly different, even though there's still a pretty stereotypical layout of the spinal cord and we know where to go to get each function. But with very small wires, they're 50 micron wires, so they're smaller than a hair. And so getting the precise targeting every time is quite tricky. But also, for example, you have 2 electrodes that both extend the knee. When you stimulate through each of those individually, you might get medium forces. But if you stimulate both of them together, it's actually more than the sum of the 2. So those kinds of motor networks are still intact. And that's also how we can get one electrode might produce an entire extension movement. So the stimulation is really complicated. Yeah, we can get lots of very complex movements out of it. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask a quick question. Parroting what a lot of everyone else has said, this was really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. I guess another question I had was, I think you alluded to a previous one, but were different GVFs were some of them hard to learn than others, and how did sort of that impact the effects?
Yeah, good question. I would kind of say not really, but I didn't explore a ton either. You know, I didn't fiddle with a lot of parameters except for maybe alpha to avoid divergence. So I would say like they're actually pretty easy to learn. I think also too because they're already filtered and they're fairly rhythmic. We didn't really run into too many troubles with the cumulants that we were using. Yeah, so it was actually the start to finish of planning, designing this controller and implementing in the cats actually went surprisingly fast, just because, we had good reliable sensor signals. We had, background knowledge on what the walking cycle should look like. And then also just because I had used the spinal cord stimulation for other experiments in the past. So like actually getting it to fruition was actually pretty quick and it didn't require too much tuning. Yeah, so I will also say another plug for Patrick, that the selective Canerva coding was really nice and really easy to implement. And so I think that made it easier. And I used that to have the flexibility of, if we needed to add or take away sensors because they were, either not contributing well or we just needed more information to make these predictions. Part of why I chose that method for state representation was so that we could have the option to add more sensors later if we found that we did need, something like accelerometers or a speed signal, or, if later we wanted to add muscle activity, which I think is a realistic plan. So, having that kind of flexibility and not have to completely rework your state representation and debug everything, it was actually really easy to do that with selective Canerva coding.
Thanks.
All right. If there are no more questions, let's all thank Ashley for the fascinating talk.
Awesome talk, Ashley. This is super cool work.
Thanks, Patrick.